So the first topic is EUSES for KOC and BCF, which I present on behalf of our colleague Alberto Martin. So don't challenge me too much on questions about EUSES. So the current situation in EUSES is there are two models considered. Both of them require log KOV as input. So let's say EUSES are used to calculate the KOC and the BCF value. And they are for log KOV range for KOC between 1 and 7.5, and for the BCF value between 1 and 10. The issue is EUSES does not check whether the predicted substance is structurally related to those used to create the model. So means you have several EUSES. You can choose predominantly hydrophobic, for example, and you, as the user, you decide which ones you want to choose, but there is no check behind if your choice is in fact the correct one. So the experience shows that the error of the calculation is high for substances outside the structural domain, and this is, as said, not checked by EUSES. So the KOC models requires manual selection of the chemical class to which the substance belongs, and selecting the wrong chemical class for a substance can lead to considerable differences, so up to 3 log units. The KOC model performs worst case, for example, for ionic species. So the change options are in fact 3. The first one is there is no update of, at all, so the same options as currently implemented in EUSES would be used. There are no costs and also no improvement. The second option would be limit the calculations, so the KOC user would be allowed only for a log KOV smaller than 3, and the BCF user only for log KOV 4.5. It's easy to implement and a lower risk of very erroneous predictions, and for some substances with a log KOV above 4.5, BCF may not be available. And the reason for the proposed numbers is simply that at least under REACH, if your substance has a log KOC above 3, you anyway would need measured data. So that's the reasoning behind setting that limit. And the third option would be docking with a EUSES platform, so retrieve predictions from another software, for example, KESA or ChemProp. The advantage is it's an automatic domain check for predictions, and the cons is it's a really heavy IT implementation. So putting this red frame around the second option, that's the option, let's say, that we would propose. Is limit calculations depending on the log KOV value. From the proposed options, limiting the EUSES calculation seems the most cost-efficient approach. And in addition, replacing the existing models by newer ones is possible. So the KOC model from Franco and Trapp as an example, and for the BCF models, there are also certain authors available. But again, the log KOV, this is only relevant for substances with a log KOV below 3, and for when it comes to the BCF models, substances for log KOV below 4.5. And the priority level is quite high. Focusing here on option 2, the implementation is easy. There is an increased reliability for regulatory purposes, a lower risk for erroneous estimation for absorptive or high BCF potential substances, and new data requirements only if KOC model by Franco is implemented the PKA. The next topic, that's topic 2, is related to release scenarios, a proposal to revisit the current approach for designing the release module in EUSES. The current situation is that EUSES differentiates between biocides and REACH. So emission scenarios developed for biocides, specifically for consumption-based approach, are not available for REACH assessment, although some may be relevant, and that answers your question this morning related to the direct release. So let's say that would be an example. On the other hand, SPERCs and emission scenarios are similar concepts, although developed in different contexts. So likewise, the SPERCs could be also useful for the assessment of biocides. So biocides looking specifically at the tonnage-based approach. What also need to be noted, there is an incremental implementation of biocides ESD in the current EUSES. So each scenario within each PT is implemented individually, although some of the scenarios are the same or similar. It's just that the receiving soil volume, for example, differentiate. But if you look at the model setup, it is really similar. There is an increased complexity due to incremental implementation and consequently also an increased risk of bugs in EUSES. And it's not always a systematic approach in modeling release exposure across the ESD and then logically also in EUSES. So, for example, some emission scenarios calculate local emissions as well as local concentrations. As said this morning, we try to fix that a little bit in this EUSES quick fix. So it would be a task also to reflect the exposure elements, then not or the concentration calculations of concentrations not in the release module, but in the later fate and distribution module. As a proposal would be to analyze the various scenarios, release and local exposure across the ESD to identify, in fact, similarities and differences, and develop a proposal for an IT implementation for looking at improved consistency. Local emission and release module, local concentration should then go logically in the fate and distribution module. There should be a consistent implementation of emission estimation, so looking a little bit at the emission scenarios specifically for biocides to see which are parallel and which could be in fact more harmonized also by the naming, and then also more robust implementation of new scenarios in the future, so by harmonization of the parameters. And we started a little bit the analysis by collecting the various fate and distribution models implemented for local exposure. I'm not going through them, I'm just showing. So what we did is in fact looking at the release route. So let's say we have identified the main release route, which are air, soil, and switching back water, and then go back again. So where do we have local direct release to air? We have local direct release to agricultural soil and non-agricultural soil. Then looking at the receiving compartment, and also looking at the subsequent compartments. So for example, if you have release to surface water, you may also have release to sediment. So let's say, again, this is a first attempt just to structure a little bit, looking at all the ESD, going and have a level higher, looking at the compartments to which you have release, direct release, and what are in fact your subsequent compartments. Again, the same for water. So an approach for developing EUSES to be further analyzed will happen in fact during the pre-study, which we expect to take place in early 2019. So that would be, let's say, the starting point, or in the frame of the pre-studies, we would look further at this table. Streamlining of the implementation is important for IT development perspective, but increases also the user friendliness and also maybe the understanding for the scenarios, and an increased consistency and rationalization within and between the regulatory areas is also something we think would be definitely of benefit. So therefore we consider this is a high priority.
So let's go through, first of all, the release estimation module update in EUSES. So what is the current situation in EUSES? For the biocide, we have only release estimation module from ESD before 2010 available. Be aware that there is ongoing update of a release module reflecting situation at the end of 2017 under preparation. This is the quick fix also Heike and others have already mentioned during the day. And for REACH, we still have the release estimation based on the AB tables. So the A for the release factor, B for the amount at time of emission tables, which somehow also we had already some remark from Romanas that they are not accepted anymore unless there is a further justification on that. So that's why we need to change for sure. For the biocide specific, we need to add a sub-scenario prepared after 2017 for product type, and add a new revised exposure scenario document prepared after 2017. Why I'm talking about 2017? Because those that are prepared before 2017 will be already implemented in the EUSES 2.0, which will be available around quarter one, at the beginning of 2019. And of course, there is a need to adapt and change the default value as agreed in the working group. For the REACH, as said before, we need to remove, for the reason I said before, the AB table, so which are not further supported somehow from our existing guidance. We need to instead introduce our default release system, which is the ERC release factors, which should be somehow supported by use description, because ERC is somehow use descriptor driven. And we need to adapt the default site tonnage calculation either for the industrial uses or for the widespread uses according to our existing guidance provisions. So, very short, for us is very high importance because for biocides and for REACH, because it reflects the current, it should reflect the current guidance uses. It should have the emission scenario documents update in them, and so on. Of course, it is also ready for implementation for both biocides and REACH. For biocides, I mentioned before that we have already an implementation phase in a EUSES 2.0, and for REACH-oriented things, we have already implemented this kind of concept in CASA. So we have a CASA experience which is already good to put in the EUSES update process. So we have talked before about the release scenario. These are a couple of release scenarios. This is the first that we have tried to understand whether to implement or not. There are generally scenarios that covers lack in the current situation in EUSES. The first one is the direct release to agricultural soil. So, as you know, there is no direct release of substance to agricultural soil at a local scale. Instead, we have indirect release to soil at the local scale via sludge application, so when the substance goes to the sludge of the STP, and by air deposition. Then, according to this indirect soil release, we have a soil concentration which is calculated after 10 years of application of the sludge and average over 30 or 180 days according to the pack we wanted to use and for each endpoint we wanted to use. For example, 180 days is used mainly for environment, like 30 days is for the pack soil. So, what we would like to change and why we would like to change, or what is the proposal in this case. So, what to change is to implement a direct release concept in EUSES as developed by, for example, LET or FE tool. The initial proposal here, and you can find in the background document, comes from the LET tool mainly. This is only because we had the equation where let tool is based on. But of course, there is a need of further discussion on both to the developers if we want to go further on this in this case. The advantage to have such a change in EUSES is about harmonization. We have one tool covering this. The easiness to take the regional assessment into account and to have a direct connection of the outcome of EUSES to CASA, which would not be the case if we maintain the lack of this scenario in EUSES. So our main preliminary ideas for implementation is to propose for a default assessment implementation, meaning a simplified option where you have only one application of substances per year, no crops uptake, soil very basic one, bare soil, and so on. Of course, this type of simplified option will cover for sure probably mainly the generic assessment by the registrant, but for example with the M-safe calculation in absence of detailed information on EUSES. On the other hand, this of course is not suitable for the refined assessment, and the tools I mentioned before will be anyway available for the refined assessment if needed. And of course, one thing I told you about the LED tool before. The LED tool, I think we have as a disadvantage at least, that does not consider 10 years of accumulation of substance in the soil, while this is the basic, is the main thing we have considered for the sludge application, 10 years of application. This is something we need to consider, even because the FAE tool does consider this 10 years of application. This is just to say that there are differences between the two, and we need also to align and harmonize with the R16 guidance a bit. And there are other many points of discussion. I mentioned here someone, for example, how the runoff is calculated, because the runoff takes quite a role in this kind of models, because it brings to the surface water concentration. Is a worst case suggested by LET or other assumptions or other alternatives like in FAE tool? The sediment concentration is not calculated as it is in R16 guidance. It's basically more related to a sort of direct release to the sediment in itself. Is it suitable, even if deviating from R16 provisions or not? And of course, we need any way to integrate other modules in this, because this model I mentioned before, LET and FAE tool, does not consider emission to air, direct affecting the human exposure, or the food chain accumulation, crops, and so on. The priority level. You see now that we have no an high importance level, as you already mentioned by Anna. First of all, is medium. Why is medium? Is medium because, in our opinion, it fills, of course, in one hand, it fills a gap that EUSES does not cover. On the other way, it only affects a limited number of substances, on basically the co-formulants in pesticides and substances in fertilizers. But on the other hand, is nearly ready for the implementation, is documented in other tools, even though, as said, open points need to be discussed. Anyway, one option, one of the advantage of, as said before, for this implementation is the harmonization of the tool in the R16 guidance as far as possible. This is another release scenario we're working on. So is a release scenario of from reservoir, or you can call it in another way, but the question is when the substance is released to water, not continuously over the year, over 200 days or whatever it is, but is only released few days a month, few days, 1 day a week, or something like that. how to take this release estimation into account in the exposure estimation there. There is a key parameter in EUSES, which is called time of emission, which is in fact is the number of emission days per year, which serves for the derivation, which is used for the derivation of the local concentration during episode, which is a local concentration which is used for the PEC water calculation, PEC sediment calculation, even soil PEC calculation, and an annual average concentration, or PEC annual, which is used, for example, for media environment, for secondary poisoning, and so on. Both need to be calculated, and both are calculated by time of emission. In one case, only during the emission days, in the other case, in the average time over the year to calculate the annual average concentration. But instead, we have only one time of emission for both air, which is supposed to be more continuous emission, and water emission. That mainly, in many cases, is a continuous emission, in other cases not. So what we propose to change is to differentiate the time of emission to air and water to better support this continuous release to water. What are the sources of this continuous release to waters? For example, waste scrubber exchange, which comes from overspray collection of coatings and so on, or bath exchange of bath for metal surface treatment. These are only few cases that can be mentioned. Or, for example, from release coming from cleaning of non-regular cleaning operation. The advantage to have such a release scenario where we differentiate this time of emission in EUSES is that there is not need to combine different EUSES runs to perform the assessment, because workaround is still possible now, but you have to perform two different assessments and take different outcome for the different run you make. And to have a direct connection to CASA, so the results will be directly connected to CASA. What is the importance? What is the priority level? We think is a low-medium importance, because while filling a gap in EUSES-based assessment is only affect an only limited number of situations. In example, there are very few spares so far that are covering a case of this reservoir exchange. On the other hand, the change is very easy and very ready to be implemented. And then I pass to another topic that has been already mentioned somewhere now before. That is the update of the simple treat. So the current situation is that we have a simple treat implemented in EUSES, a simple treat 3.1, version 3.1, estimating the chemical emission from sewage treatment plants. What we propose to change in the update of EUSES is to implement the new simple treat 4.0 with new default STP operational values. At least what we have, we can propose here is to include an higher BOD loading rates and a lower sludge loading rates with from 0.15 to 0.1. These two types of changes has been somehow supported by the data we have and has been already agreed in the biocide world. This adaptation results in a higher hydraulic retention time from 7 to 11, more or less, hours, which means more time for degradation and absorption for the substance. We are not proposing instead to have a new default for suspended soil concentration in the effluent. Originally, it was proposed to pass from 30 to 7.5 milligram per liter. This is because is not yet this data is not supported EU-wide.
Something. What? Where? What? It doesn't show anything here. It's nothing here. Hang up. I hang up. Yeah, I try. It doesn't.
And then you select the local
Ah, okay. Great. Thank you. Yeah.
We are back to our STP. And I said before, there is another change in the STP Simple 340, that the new version allows for ionizing organic partitioning. But of course, this topic has been already covered, it is connected to the QSAR discussion we had before with ICE. Of course, there are points for discussion, for example, whether we wanted to allow for industrial site-specific biological STP setting in EUSES, for example, to have the possibility to change the fraction settling the primary sedimentation, or whether we can set user-specified fraction of BOD in raw sludge in the solid and dissolved form, or whether we have the possibility to change this value. In general, I think there is an open question on the possibility on the room of maneuvering of having the user to the possibility to override agreed default value. And the priority level, of course, is important, is high important, because affect exposure of all substances has been already somehow agreed and so on, and is ready for implementation. We think is ready for implementation because Simple 340 is already available as a standalone estimation tool.
Okay, so a picture can say more than 1,000 words sometimes. So basically, if you follow a chemical from the house to the river, there's an element of that pathway that has not been really modeled yet, and that is the time that the chemical is in the sewer system. And actually, we know that sewer is not just for most chemicals, not a really neutral environment, but some things can happen. So as I said, this is presently unmodeled in the EUSES. However, for chemicals that are biodegradable, hydrolyzable, or for example reactive chemicals like oxidants, we know for sure that the mass load that leaves the house is not the mass load that comes in the wastewater treatment plant, and therefore industry is interested in more realism in the risk assessment. So we make a recommendation to include a sewer model, and it's not so difficult to do that. Actually, there's some science today that allows to do that, that would then lead to a better estimation of your sea local. There's now a new OECD method, 314, that has 4 blocks, but one of the blocks is evaluating the biodegradation of chemicals in sewage under simulated sewer conditions. So that gives you a kinetic of disappearance of your chemical under sewage conditions. So that gives you a kinetic rate. And if you combine that kinetic rate with distribution of the time that the chemical is typical on its way from the house to the wastewater treatment plant, you can estimate a removal factor. Now, for many chemicals, industry or the registrants will not have this number, then you just keep it 0 like it is now. But if you have the possibility to do it, we think it could be a good addition. So I just want to refer to the fact that the science is there in our opinion. So there's publications on sewer residence times. This is a paper for the US. I'm not 100% sure we have exactly the same amount of data for Europe, but it would not be such a big task to collect those. But that gives you a kind of distribution of, okay, how long is your chemical in the sewer? And then you have another publication that illustrates, for example, for surfactants, how you can apply this OECD 314 test. So basically what we say, the technology is there if you want to do it. For example, I don't know, for those if you have registered oxidative chemicals like peroxide or hypochlorite, there's not a milligram of those chemicals that reaches the wastewater treatment plant between the house, and that is basically a big error in the risk assessment. Now speaking a little bit how to implement this in practice, I'll keep it very short. So the idea is to implement a removal factor, which is 0 as a default, and then you could implement a first order decay rate that can cover both a chemical reaction processes, hydrolysis, or aerobic and or anaerobic biodegradation process. So it's not so important to know what happens, but it's just to know important how fast this happens. And if you combine this then with your residence time, you can calculate the removal factor with the following formula. Details not important today, it's just the idea whether you want it or you don't want it. So what do we think is needed to make this happen in practice? I think it's important that we double check the equations and the concepts with some expert modelers from ECHA or RIVM or others that are interested in this. This comes before simple treat, so it should be conceptually marriable with simple treat, but I think that is perfectly possible. And then we should develop in the chapter 16 of the TGD a specific guidance section on how to include this and how to test and when to use it and when not to use it. And then probably for Europe we will have to make a distribution of sewer residence times, but I think that is a project that could be realized in a reasonable time frame. So in our view, everything is there to implement this little nice add-on in EUSES if we want.
So 6 topics. Many of them have been identified and introduced by Dick in the project commissioned by ECHA to RIVM. So many of them come from Dick, and there's some other ones as well, some new ones. So this one's new. This is about site-specific local air assessment. Well, the current situation in EUSES calculates the local concentration in air from a standard factor. And uses the source strength, or the standard factor is the concentration in air at a fixed emission, so 1 kilogram per day. And when you have the actual emission rate, you can calculate concentration in air from that factor. So this is very straightforward. This factor has been derived from a Gaussian plume model, LPS, and assumes standard source characteristics and weather conditions. These cannot be changed. These are fixed, but actually have a large influence. So if you want to do a site-specific assessment, well, EUSES isn't fit for that, of course, for site-specific assessment. So, but it is used for that purposes in some cases, for instance, in the application for authorization. And then we thought, okay, it might be good to have this possibility in EUSES to do a more or less site-specific assessment, taking source characteristics into account. Well, there's a simple tool developed by the RIVM, which can be used to derive local air concentrations. And what it actually is a table with factors, standard factors, depending on the effective chimney height and the distance from the source. And the effective chimney height can be determined from the real chimney height and the heat content of the plume. So this is already available. It's not available, so it's available for calculating local concentration in air, but it's not available for calculating the deposition fluxes from air to soil. So that's something that has to be added to be consistent with the procedures in EUSES. And also something to consider is that a more recent version of OPS is used, so we might need to recalculate the current factor in the EUSES because the new version, OPS version, might generate some different values, so we have to check that. We thought that this might be of medium importance because there is no standard requirement, chemical safety assessment. It's only useful for a limited number of cases for site-specific assessments and application for authorization. So it can be used for calculating local air concentrations, but you have to do some additional work to derive standard deposition factors. And most importantly, I guess we have to add some extra guidance to inform people how to do local site-specific assessment. This one, yes, it's very much related. Local deposition, volatile substances from air to soil. A while ago, industry communicated this to RGM and also had contact with Dick about this issue. And they accounted the situation that a high concentration in local soil is calculated for very volatile chemicals emitted to air. Well, this is how it's done in EUSES. You have the deposition from substances bound to particulates in the atmosphere, and you have the gaseous phase, so this deposition from the gaseous phase. Well, you can do a quite quick check and see that deposition for aerosol-bound part is not relevant for volatile chemicals. So you have to look at the gaseous phase, and the deposition from the gaseous phase to soil is actually based on two factors. So we have the partitioning between the gas phase and raindrops, and the rain events, the deposition to soil. We also have the gas absorption from air to soil. So the dry deposition velocity, and this is a fixed value in EUSES of 0.01 centimeters per second. So we have to look a little bit more in detail. Possibility is it's possible that this standard factor is too high for volatile chemicals, and it also might be possible that volatilization from soil may be too low. It is volatilization from soil is included in the EUSES calculations. So these are the two possibilities. We have to look into further detail. So gas absorption and volatilization, they're now actually two independent parameters. We have this fixed value and we have the volatilization from soil based on the simple box equation for gas absorption and volatilization. So what we have to do is to check whether we can use this algorithm being used on the regional scale, whether we can use it on the local scale as well to make some kind of correction for this dry deposition velocity. So that's I think one critical thing we have to do to check how we could correct this. It's quite important, and because impact may be large, and the proposed change would lead to considerable lower concentrations in soil at the local scale. Not completely ready. We have some discussions with Dick about possible solutions. I think there might be several solutions, so we could have to see what's the best solution, most the easiest solution, so with less, not too much changes in the equations as they are currently present in EUSES. Next one, modeling episodic rain. Yes. Yes, EUSES regional distribution part. So the simple box model assumes constant drizzle, so which is unrealistic, and consequently the atmospheric fate, especially for highly soluble chemicals, is predicted incorrectly. Well, it has been shown that modeling episodic rain improves the precision between steady state and complex dynamic models. The proposed change will affect predicted concentrations in air, of course, water and soil at the largest spatial scales. The local concentrations would not be affected, because these are calculated differently. To solve this, a model formulation worked out and published by Juliet and Hochschild can be implemented. It's approximation specifically designed to be implemented in multimedia and box models, and it already has been included in Simple Box, the latest version 4.0. We judge this as low importance, mainly because this only would affect the concentration at the regional scale, the higher scales, and a limited number of chemicals, mainly highly soluble chemicals. Well, it's ready, can be implemented. It's already being implemented in Simple Box, so we can copy it right from there into EUSES.
Okay.
Next one, assessment of photolytic degradation. Well, environmental half-life for fertilizers can be entered into EUSES, but the issue is that often only the information from standardized tests is available, and fertilizers half-lives on the real environmental conditions are often hard to find, and the user doesn't provide any insistence on how to convert the value from the standardized test to real environmental situation. Castro, Jimenez, and they made a proposal on how to do this. So this can be used and implemented in EUSES. The importance is just to be low, mainly because photodegradation is often not very relevant under field conditions. It doesn't affect the local assessment in EUSES, and will only affect the concentration of the larger species scales. And well, may be relevant for those specific kind of chemicals that are persistent to biodegradation, and in these cases, photolysis might be important. It's technically ready, it's implemented in a test version of Simple Box, so there are no constraints on that part, so it can be easily be transferred into EUSES. Yeah. Initial local pack in soil. Yes. The local pack in soil, as it is currently implemented in EUSES, is calculated as an average value over 30 days, 180 days after the last application of sewage sludge for 10 consecutive years. And well, from the other side, when you're looking at the standard toxicity test, they are usually expressed on the basis of initial or nominal concentrations. So this means that degradation of the substance in the soil is not consistently taken into account in both the PEC calculation and the PNEC parameters. So there's a discrepancy. So the PNEC soil, based on nominal concentrations, should therefore be compared to the initial PEC instead of the average PEC over 30 or 100 days. So this has been discussed and agreed upon for biocides assessment. So therefore it's suggested to include this in the EUSES to provide the initial PNEC in soil. Well, actually, it is calculated in the EUSES, but it's not presented as such. So it will be a very minor effort to have this available in the EUSES. Well, it's required for biocides assessment, therefore we thought it's important. It could be used for other chemicals as well, but this has not been discussed, for instance, in the context of REACH. Well, it's ready to be implemented, it's quite clear, so no issue, I think. Okay, let's move on. Last one, depth-dependent concentration in soil. So multimedia mass balance models typically assume compartments are well mixed for certain depth, and this is, well, not true in many cases for real soils. According to theory, concentrations in soil decline exponentially with depth. This is shown, for instance, in a study by McCone and Bennett. So assuming well-mixed soil might lead to large misestimation of the transfer processes. This is because transfer processes from soil take place at the interface with other compartments or at a certain depth and not over the average depth. So therefore the transport coefficients need to be corrected. This correction factor is actually the concentration at a specific depth divided by the average concentration. Can be calculated from the equation displayed. And in this equation, dt is the total depth or the fixed depth in EUSES, and dp is the chemical dependent characteristic soil penetration depth. So this is really a chemical dependent parameter. It can be calculated, but I didn't show the calculation right here because it's quite elaborate. So what do we have to do to incorporate this correction factor? We have to set the relevant depths for the specific transport processes. So for instance, for leaching and runoff and volatilization, take place at the interface, so the depth will be 0. So we have to look at this into more details on how to implement this in the EUSES, but it already has been implemented in SimpleBox, so we can do it the same way. The issue is that SimpleBox assumes a fixed value for this dp, this chemical dependent characteristic penetration depth. And on the other hand, there's the possibility to calculate this for specific chemicals. It's chemical dependent. So there's something we have to think about and to see what's the best way to go forward. We think it's important because it has a high impact in the exposure calculation. It will affect, of course, the soil compartment at the local scale as well as the larger regional scale. And for the larger regional scale, also the other compartments directly connected to soil. It's ready to be implemented. Proposed method is documented and verified and implemented already in Simple Box. Thank you.